Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third and final, for now, conversation of 12 Arguments for Change, Shaping King County's Post-COVID Future. I'm King County Executive Constantine. I'll be moderating tonight's panel. First, I'd like to acknowledge that King County is on the traditional land of the Coast Salish people. And I am tonight coming to you from the land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and I wish to honor with gratitude the land itself and the original people of the Salish Sea. Now, for those of you who are new to this series, our goal is to identify how to make our region's post-COVID future better than our pre-COVID past. We want to add to the conversations that many of us are already having, whether it be with coworkers or families or neighbors or friends, how to shape a King County and, by extension, a nation that is inclusive and that provides opportunity for all. So far, we've had two sessions with two amazing and thoughtful panels. We framed the problem, we've identified the main challenges to recovering into a future that is better than the past, and we've brainstormed some solutions to center equity and sustainability in our recovery. Tonight, we're going to get right to it. Our focus is on how to turn those solutions into reality. And before I introduce the panelists, a few housekeeping items to get out of the way. We are hosting this as a Zoom webinar. Only the panelists have their microphones and cameras on. But audience members on Zoom can use the Q&A button at the bottom of their Zoom window to submit questions to the panel. And we will work to answer as many as we can get to during this session. And we'll also be monitoring comments submitted by people who are watching on Facebook. Now, our panelists for tonight are Lisa Daugaard, the Director of the Public Defender Association; April Sims, Secretary-Treasurer of the Washington State Labor Council; Brian Carter, Executive Director of For Culture; and Cauce, the President of the University of Washington. Thanks to all of you for being with us here tonight. Now, Tuesday's panel identified some solutions for recovery into a better future, a more broadly prosperous, more sustainable, more equitable future. They included ideas that we've heard for many years, creating pathways to home ownership, introducing universal health care, changing Washington's regressive tax structure. But there were other ideas just as urgent that are very much part of this moment, like shifting all organizations across the spectrum, whether we're talking about arts or government, environmental activism or labor, to be anti-racist organizations. Encouraging those in power to use that power by creating opportunities for those who have historically been excluded. And paying attention to the intersectionality of social issues, no matter your particular sphere or focus. Are there other solutions, panelists, that you would mention here up front that maybe the last group didn't identify? And we'll start with you, Lisa.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so honored to be among this group and really looking forward to the discussion over the next hour. Did listen to the dialogue on Tuesday night, and I think it's not so much a piece that was missing as an aspect of the discussion around economic equity, racial justice, and really the future for small business that I think needs to be fleshed out a little bit. And this is work that my organization does. We're a little bit deceptively called the Public Defender Association. We did used to be a public defense law firm, but King County has taken responsibility for that work now very ably. We work on alternatives to punitive enforcement-based systems that really engage and take seriously public order and public safety issues, but making what we speak of as the least necessary use of coercive punitive institutions, and try to tackle most public order issues from the perspective of public health, well-being, and trauma recovery. So that is just background to say that the issue that we are really staring in the face, and the big need and the big opportunity that we're trying to call our peer organizations in to respond to, is the crisis of extreme poverty in our city and region. I was recently in South Africa, and I have to say, I grew up as an anti-apartheid activist and have thought about South Africa for many, many years. Went to talk about alternative responses to drug activity, talking about our LEAD model there. And I was really struck that per capita, we have more people living in public, in completely unsupported communities than is the case in South Africa's cities, and in Soweto and elsewhere in favelas in other nations. People have accepted that folks are living, in informal structures, but they have utilities, they have public services that we have not provided. So we really have an extreme situation with regard to public homelessness and with regard to public order issues related to unmet behavioral health needs. So it is, and I'm just going to sort of boil this down really simply. Many activists, I spent decades as an activist, so I say this with fullest respect, but a lot of activism, right, is focused on, with complete legitimacy, focused on things that we need to stop doing, things that are wrong, mistakes that have been made, that have perpetuated structural inequality in a really devastating way, and rightly so. But stopping is not a positive agenda, and this is something that, as a sort of civil rights activist, I felt called out, or was constructively called out on like 15 years ago by some community leaders who are like, y'all are about stop the drug war. That's great, but then are our kids going to be left out on the street corner with selling drugs as the only available economic option? Because that's really not enough of an agenda. And so starting at that point, our work began to focus on replacing old systems, not by nothing. Our staff today earlier were talking about that as abandonment, just bringing existing punitive structures to an end, leaving people out there is not an agenda that anybody should be excited about fighting for. And COVID really gave us, we're in a really dynamic moment in the conversation about the role of police, the role of the criminal legal system. I really appreciate your leadership, Executive Constantine, in using the budget process as an avenue for remaking approaches to these problems. But interestingly, before George Floyd's death, COVID had actually given us a dry run experience of what is it when police don't engage these issues. Most law enforcement agencies directed their officers not to take proactive action with respect to most public order issues because of COVID transmission. The jails were functionally closed to most bookings due to COVID transmission fears, and the courts were closed. So we sort of already were running an unscheduled experiment with what happens, and some engines of harm, ground to a halt. But what also happened is that people began struggling with behavioral health challenges out on our sidewalks and in our neighborhoods, and nobody was coming for them. And so we ended up, long story short, and I won't take you down the rabbit hole, remaking almost everything that we do to match a reality where the agenda had to be one of going into the field, engaging people where every system had shut down to them. And as a result, they were in a very miserable state and vulnerable to illness and other conditions. But as well, the state in which people are living makes it almost impossible for small businesses to recover. And it's just fundamental right now that we find the broadest possible common ground for an approach to public order and safety that makes the least necessary use of coercive structures, but does notice that all other systems are loaded against that same population and remakes a health-based approach that genuinely has the potential to resolve public order issues in the interest of all. So to me, that's the work of our generation, and we can do it, but almost everything has to change.
This really great crystallization of the challenge we've come to realize. It's not just about stopping doing something or divesting from something. You have to invest, you have to reimagine and create structures to overcome the deficits that have been created by the old structures. And that's why in my budget, I said yesterday, we're going to divest, invest, and reimagine. And a lot of the work that we're trying to do across the spectrum goes right to what you just identified. April Sims.
Yeah, thank you. Executive Constantine, I thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And I'm looking forward to learning from my fellow panelists this evening. I'm April Sims. I use she, her pronouns. I also make my home on the traditional land of the Cauce people, the first people of Puyallup, the Puyallup tribe, and I want to honor with respect and gratitude their elders, past and present, for their stewardship of its land and its people. I am also, mine is the story of stolen people on stolen land. So I raise my voice in support of the fight for Black liberation and the movement for Black lives. I'm excited to be here with you tonight. I think the list of solutions that the fellow panelists brainstormed was marvelous. There were a couple of things, though, that I would love to lift up. First, I think access to affordable, quality childcare has to be included in our solutions. We are learning so much about the impacts of COVID and how many folks don't have access to affordable quality childcare. I think enforcing worker protections so that workers are supported and have access to remedies and justice on the job. And of course, better access to union jobs that pay a livable wage and provide a glide path to the middle class. I was raised by a single mother of 3, and it was my mom's union job that got our family off of welfare and ended the cycle of homelessness and poverty that my family was trapped in. And it was her union pension that gave her economic dignity for the first time in her life. So any solutions that we look at absolutely have to include how we are making sure that workers have the right to join a union and access to more unionized jobs. But then I also think, I grew up on the hilltop in Tacoma, which, historically was a low-income neighborhood that had suffered from years of, devastating redlining policies. And I watch now the way my community has changed over time, and the investments that the city has made in the hilltop have made it unaffordable for many of the families who used to call that neighborhood home. My grandparents, when they migrated here from Seattle, settled in the Central District, and my grandmother made Seattle her home until she passed away in '92. And if she were alive today, she would be able to afford to live in this neighborhood. So I think, adding to the solution is having governments like King County both invest in historically marginalized communities and protect families that live in those communities from future displacement.
Thank you. That is indeed a real challenge that we have grappled with in urban unincorporated communities, for example, as we seek to make investments in White Center or Skyway. What is going to happen if those investments then catalyze a land rush that ultimately ends up displacing the very communities we're trying to help? We have to find the right mechanisms. Thank you. I think that's a critically important issue. Brian Carter from For Culture.
Well, good evening, all. Thank you, Executive Constantine, for inviting me. Happy to be here with the other panelists. I'm the Executive Director for Culture, which is the Cultural Development Authority within King County. So we support cultural workers, cultural organizations, and the work that they do, I think, to enhance the quality of life for everybody in King County. And I had a chance to listen in on the first two panels. And I think, like the other panelists, that I really believe that racism and other forms of structured inequity, they sap our potential to become the healthiest nation possible. So one thing that I wanted to introduce into the conversation was, I think, a necessary discussion about the ways in which we must tame the will to stay engaged in this work. How do we preserve the will to demand social justice as the path to the healthiest version of our nation? How do we maintain that courage of our convictions when the current outrage and fervor inevitably subsides? And this is all credit to those who sustain activism in their work in between these moments of national trauma. I think I'm more talking to a silent majority that I think is quite dangerous within this county and within the nation. So for me, I think what we're talking about so often when we talk about the racism that's inherent in this country and our desire to, I think, infuse anti-racist behaviors into all of these solutions is we're talking about a reckoning with our past. So this is at times an acknowledgement of enslavement, genocide, Jim Crow, redlining, the list just goes on and on. But an acknowledgement that those events, are directly responsible for the conditions of today. So in this moment, I think our will to remember, really allows those events, those traumas, the experiences of the past to inspire us to act. But I think as time marches on, our willingness to remember, therefore our willingness to act can begin to erode. And I think there's just a danger, in the erasure of traumatic events in the interest of reconciliation. So for me, confronting, our most traumatic memories, it enables us to do something really important. And that's to see those linkages between the past and the present. So for me, I think added to the discussion is, how are we committed to connecting the past to the present, How are we committed to connecting memory to action? And how do we actually do that? I know anytime you're talking about complex, historical experiences and the ways in which those experiences are collectivized in our memory, you have the difficulty of the fact that we need to reshape that reality, to fit into some kind of vessel that we use to carry our past, to carry our memories. And for me, the question is, what vessels are we actually creating in this moment? What vessels are we choosing to carry the narrative of our troubled past? And I'll just give a real concrete example. I think of Brian Stevenson and his project, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama, which is really the country's first memorial, that's dedicated to the legacy of enslaved Black people, people terrorized by lynching. So what would the equivalent in King County be to carry the weight of our past wrongs so that we are forced to remember, so that we're forced to maintain that essential ingredient for social justice, which to me is sustained will. So I think having a collectively agreed upon, whether it's a site of conscience, we need something that's commiserate, I think, with the enormity of this current reckoning. And it is my fear that we are not creating that, whether that be a physical structure, a physical place, or something large enough that helps us create that vessel that will keep us in this moment, in this headspace. And that's my greatest fear, is that we do not have this panel in 3 months. We don't have this panel in a year. That's my concern. How do we sustain that will? So to me, that structure of sustaining will is a critical solution that I think has to be talked about.
One of our panelists talked about a window that opens and begins to close again. And I think that is really an apt metaphor. And your addition to the point, which is that we need something that is physical and tangible and big and compels us to continue to confront our past, is a really fascinating addition to this conversation. Anna-Mari Cauce, the same question, what would you add to the points from the last panel?
First of all, I want to say what an honor it is for me to be here with the other panelists. Just listening to them, I am so incredibly inspired. I was going to mention, I'm so glad that April mentioned daycare, because that is absolutely critical. And it's a real problem in our area. Access to affordable daycare is something that everyone is really struggling for. And this pandemic, the great revealer, has really, really made that clear. And the number of, obviously its caretakers can be men or women, but primarily it falls on women that are juggling, their children's education and at my university while they're also teaching, et cetera, has really led to all kinds of exhaustions and difficulty and, quite frankly, barriers to career progression. I think what I'm going to mention is pretty obvious given where I came from, and quite frankly, it was mentioned by the other panelists. I just want to make it more front and center. Dr. Ben Danielson, for example, said, you can't keep an uneducated child healthy, and you can't educate an unhealthy child. And so I want to just, center the role of education in all this and how critical it is that starting, from preschool all the way to higher education, that we really, really have equitable access, and that education be affordable for everybody. If you think about every single thing that we've talked about, for example, Brian was just talking about that, the importance of connecting past to present. That is something that we need to be doing in our curriculums. I think one of the problems, because, let's be clear, systemic racism runs through everything, including our educational system. And one of the things is that history tends to be written by the victors. And what we need is now a history that is much more inclusive and that allows us to connect the real past, the whole past, to the future. Education is key to economic opportunity, and we need an equitable workforce development. It's key to an informed and active citizenry. It is actually key to everything that we're talking about here. At the university, we've really been trying very hard with something called, we call it the Husky Promise, and we've had more than 40,000 students whose tuition we've been able to cover. But I want to be clear, it's not just enough to get them there, but then what kind of education? How do we make sure we still have, we're better than most universities, but there are still achievement gaps that we need to deal with, and we need to make sure that any child, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their race, ethnicity, et cetera, has access to the entire educational spectrum. It's interesting, this morning I was in a meeting with university presidents really from all over the world. And what we were talking about was the importance of universities to take on. The United Nations developed some sustainable development goals, 5 years. And I am just struck by how similar they are to what we're talking about here. There were things like number 1 is no poverty. Number 2 is zero hunger. Number 3 is good health and well-being. Number 4 is quality education. Number 10 is reduced inequalities. And then to lead up to what we're going to go next, number 17, and there's a total of 17 SDGs, is partnerships for the goals. And so I think we all recognize that to make progress on all the goals that we have, affordable housing, I do have to just for a moment, I think that I was one of the many people who really grieved over the death of Bill Gates Sr. And I think it is so apt that we should be talking about regressive tax structures, because that was something that he cared about deeply.
Thank you for making mention of that, Anna Marie. We each contribute in our own ways, and he was a larger than life character, but a lot of the really tough behind the scenes work that he did was on unearthing the inequities and insufficiencies in our state tax structure and demanding change. And that is indeed one of the main points that was brought up by the prior panel, prompted in part by me, because this is something that I've been on for a while. I wanted to just kind of continue this. We've got maybe, 8-10 minutes to talk about what are the sort of gaps here. We need to think about how we can get to the world that we're talking about, and what can we do to bridge the gaps that are between us and their community and government, education and business. This is simply a continuation of the first question, but you can name specific things that we ought to be doing. It would be great. Why don't we go back to the start and call on Lisa?
So the three gaps that I see that are going to inhibit progress on the public order, public safety issues that I was raising up are a priority in finding housing for people who present the greatest impact to neighborhoods and public order. The current way in which we allocate our, known to be inadequate supply of homeless housing really tends to deprioritize the people with greatest impact on public safety, thus creating, that's really hard on those individuals. They're already facing many, many barriers. But it's also really hard on the community as a whole, and it tends to delegitimize the whole suite of public policies that adjoin these problems of people living unsheltered and problematic behavior, because it really feels to businesses and neighborhoods and communities that there is no plan, it can never get better. That's not true. Housing First is a super reliable intervention. We just don't apply it to the people whose problems are the most visible and the most impactful, and we should probably just flip that. There is a big gap. We've been trying to assemble a multi-agency initiative to address sort of all the public order issues in Pioneer Square and the Chinatown International District, with some funding that the County Council and your Department of Community and Human Services has helped with CARES money through the end of the year. And in assembling this multi-agency partnership, we've just noticed that everyone agrees that there should be a community care alternative, right, to jail and prosecution. But when we have the chance to put that together, there are some significant gaps, and particularly for people with highest acuity mental health needs. If there's not permanent supportive housing available for that entire population, which presently there is not, there is no alternative readily available to step up. And so if you said tomorrow, as you kind of have, do what you propose, what should happen. There's a gap in the sort of provider community. Many people agree that there should be, a residential voluntary type of option for people that was attractive enough that people would choose to be there without having to be compelled or civilly committed, but there isn't. And we need people to step in and create that. The genuine community experts need to be given kind of the mandate to form that up, have the resources needed to pull it off. And without that, we're going to struggle. The last thing I'll just name is we need a more effective engagement and engagement strategy with stimulant and methamphetamine users. This population is super impactful, and the existing go-tos for users of other drugs medication-assisted treatment, not readily available for this population. We've been having good success engaging meth users in our co-lead program, which is putting unsheltered people with high barriers in hotels with a lot of support. So it's doable, but we clearly need to make that a more robust intervention, because that population is disproportionately challenging to businesses, neighborhoods that are, I just want to say this one last thing. We are lucky to have a willingness across the board, probably like 80-85% of everybody listening to this and everybody that they know likes the idea of alternative approaches to public safety. They just want them to be real, and they want them to show up and they want them to work. And it's that part that we struggle with. So methamphetamine users really are central in the place where we're challenged to show up for that set of problems, and we need to fill that gap. Thank you.
Thanks. April, same question, kind of gaps and bridges for those.
Yeah, so many things are coming to mind right now, but since Anna Mari mentioned, changing Washington's regressive tax structure, I just want to lift up that it's not by coincidence that some of the richest people in this country also live in the state with the most regressive tax system. And I remember working on Initiative 1098, which was the high earners income tax initiative that failed. I think it was in 2010. And I think we have to go back and, make sure that we are looking at our tax system and looking for ways to, there's no way that we can cut ourselves out of the budget gap that we are in right now. And it is just heartbreaking to think that the short-term solutions will be most deeply felt by those, less able to absorb those increases. So we have to have a tax system and a plan that is rooted in taxing the wealthy, and stop thinking about our government like consumers and start thinking about our government more like citizens, and charging those the most able to pay for the services with, paying their fair share. So, I want to lift that up. I know that there is an organization, Invest in Washington is a coalition that's being led by the Budget Policy Center. They're doing really good work around this. So thinking about gaps and who you might be able to work with in terms of fielding some different ideas. And I know that's beyond the scope of King County, but I just want to make sure that I gave that a little bit of airtime. And then, for enforcing worker protections, Washington State proudly boasts having the third highest union density in the nation. We are twice the national average at nearly 20%. Yep, our little state. We're just behind Hawaii and New York. And we also, not coincidentally, are the state that has some of the most robust worker protections in the nation. But unfortunately, enforcement, or, those protections are only as good as the state's ability to enforce those protections for workers. And so we worked on the Worker Protection Act last session. It failed. That will be reintroduced this year. And if this bill were in place today, we could have potentially saved a lot of lives due to COVID exposures at work. And when we think about who is most at risk, if we're thinking about this in terms of equity and applying an equity lens to everything that we do, we know that women, and particularly women of color, work in industries that are the highest exposed and the lowest paid. So anything we can do to shore up worker protections just makes our communities healthier and also gets us to the equity work that we so deeply want to do. I think, anti-racism work in government has to start with having people of color in decision-making positions, because representation absolutely matters. But it also means not expecting those folks to do all of the emotional labor to help folks learn what they need to learn to be the kind of co-conspirators and allies that we need them to be. And then, I noticed when I was listening last night, there was a conversation around pathways to help renters become homeowners. And, I'm glad that you brought up Skyway, Dow, because, I'm thinking about that Skyway coalition and the work that they've been doing, centering the needs of the community, and how investments in communities in unincorporated King County like Skyway can, lead to affordable housing and community controlled a multicultural center and policies that really get to the heart of not displacing families from those communities. So I've got more, but I'm not the only one on this panel, so I'll put myself back on mute.
Thank you so much. Brian Carter.
Yeah, I wanted to talk on a couple of issues specifically related to arts and culture and the ways in which I think implementation and the speed of implementation of these solutions can be addressed. I think it's no small thing to say that the arts and culture sector is in really dire straits at this point. When you look nationally, losses within 2020 are somewhere around 41 billion for arts and culture nationally. Within King County, you're talking about financial hardship and losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars. We've got organizations that are teetering on the brink of not being able to open their doors again and provide that essential service that culture offers, which is that reaching into the past. It is making sense of the present. It is such an additive feature of our county that there's a real danger there that I just wanted to highlight and make sure folks on this call were aware of. I think digging into the solution that was put forth, shifting all organizations across the spectrum, arts and culture, to be anti-racist. And I think about cultural groups, right, whose primary mission is to serve people of color and or lower income communities. And those groups and those cultural workers face distinct financial and organizational challenge before COVID and during COVID. And just one more statistic, and I promise that's it. When we talk about cultural funding within the United States, 60% of all cultural funding goes to 2% of organizations. Those organizations are predominantly legacy white organizations. They're not organizations that are served or led by folks of color. So one example that I wanted to give that For Culture has, I think, tried to seize the moment that we're in right now. We're trying to be really intentional about the way we address this disparity. And one way we're doing that is equity investments. So each funding program that For Culture offers, there are funds that are reserved specifically for equity investments. And these are targeted at both organizations and cultural workers who are operating within King County designated communities of opportunity. And for those who aren't aware, the communities of opportunity, it's a partnership with Seattle Foundation, King County, managed by King County Public Health. And it's used to identify areas in King County that are experiencing the highest levels of need. And by targeting our funding to these particular geographic areas, which have higher rates of poverty, which have, just the disparities across the board for all types of health measures are evident, we believe that that is our way of trying to live our racial equity goals. And I bring this up because it's something that For Culture is really proud of, but I think the implementation lesson is that in the midst of COVID, I think that there is a danger in having transitional change made at organizations, whether those arts, government, activism, that is of this moment. And for me, when COVID struck and this dual pandemic of reckoning with our own racist past and the COVID virus, it was an opportunity to say, how can we embed this particular policy change that will last beyond COVID? So I would just encourage folks as they think about that, trying to make their organizations anti-racist, how are you investing within policy change at the organization? And then just one more quick note that I wanted to make. There was another solution that was put forth around paying attention to intersectionality in social issues, no matter what sphere that you work on. And I think at For Culture, I'll just use this as an example because I think it could be pertinent for others, is that we have mindfully, and hopefully this will prove useful to us, created a social justice action team at our agency. And the reason is that we have got to find a better job of identifying the areas of confluence where culture intersects with social justice movements demanding overdue change. And we've got to do a better job of funding those areas where culture is best positioned to dismantle systemic racism. So when I think about intersectionality, it can happen informally, but I think there's got to be such a more formal tact and a structure that's created within organizations if they're going to move in that direction towards being anti-racist. So those are just two examples that I wanted to add from some of the work that we're engaged in.
Excellent, thank you. Anamari.
Well, I'm just going to underscore a lot of what was already said by the panelists. I mean, I think it comes down to, if we want to have an equi-recovery, an equitable recovery, we need to invest in communities. That's everything from infrastructure to green space, which is actually incredibly important, to economic opportunity, to K-12 education, to mental health, to nutrition, to public safety. And we need to do it with partnership and involvement of the communities that have been, historically underrepresented, oppressed, et cetera. So BIPOC populations have to be, right in the middle of it. They need to be part of the solution and involved in the solution. They know what they need. We know what we need. And, I'll give you an example, about how important it is to build coalitions. Last legislative session, we had a real victory with large companies, Microsoft, Amazon, coming to the table and taxing themselves for the Workforce Education Investment Act. It was huge, but that success came from building a broad-based coalition that it took us almost a decade to really pull together. And it really, and the reason why I think coalitions are so important is that so often I think some of the ways in which we end up staying marginalized is that we have a bunch of people fighting over smaller and smaller pieces of the pie. And we need to recognize, and I think that that's been there throughout the three panels that you put together, that these multiple agendas aren't just intersectional, they're interdependent. And that they don't, that they can't, we don't want to pit the arts against education, against business development. We need to find ways of putting them all together. And I want to underscore what Lisa said at the beginning about the fact that it can't just be about being against things, that this is bad. We have to talk about what do we stand for. What I can think about, I know I'm the oldest person in this panel. I'm 64, knocking on 65. And when I'm a child clinical psychologist by training, a community psychologist, and I came up just as deinstitutionalization was happening. And when you look back on deinstitutionalization, I want to be clear, I am not arguing for anyone to be put in institutions, but what happened is we gave people rights without looking after their needs. And if you giving people rights without actually paying attention to their needs ends up being a cruel joke. What we did is we took them out of, institutions and put them on the street. And so we really need to be thinking both about what's wrong, but not just about that. We need to figure out how do we do it better. And, one good example is public safety. Yes, we need to stop using police the way we do, but then we also have to figure out, well, what are we going to put in its place? And how do we work on that together?
So I'm going to stick with you for a second, Anna-Maria, maybe throw you a curveball here. But one of the people watching on Zoom asked, what can we do to provide anti-racist education and support education equity? And you and I have had this conversation before about how we support students who may have historically been excluded, maybe first in their family, to be in college. Do you want to take on that question for the viewer?
Absolutely. I think that there are multiple ways in which we have to do it. I mean, partly, of course, it's partly curriculum. And, we have to rewrite the traditional history books that, like I say, were written by the victors to talk about, all their strengths and really hid how things really happened. I mean, the story about, I grew up, thinking about Thanksgiving in a very different way than I think about it now. Thinking about, Christopher Columbus very differently than I think about him now. And so part of it does have to do with bringing in, the full spectrum of people into the curriculum, but it also has to do with how do we make sure, for example, that we know that women and people of color, they're much less apt to be in fields that are so important, like, computer science. At one point, computer science was just about geeks. Well, now geeks are chic, and we all have a computer in our pockets, and we're connecting with each other digitally, and having having digital savvy is important for everybody to have, and making sure that any student has access to those parts of those kinds of careers is absolutely. We need to support students who don't get the kinds of supports at home that we assume. Some people talk about the hidden curriculum, and that has to do with how you navigate the environment. And some kids have their parents are telling them how to do it, and others, we need to provide that. We need to provide our students. I mean, one of the things that we're really working on is providing better mental health across the spectrum to our students, because if you're dealing with trauma, it's very difficult to be focusing on your physics homework. And so, there really are a lot of different aspects to really being truly anti-racist. And I can't say that we've got them all down. We certainly don't. We have a lot of work to do, but I'm very committed to doing it.
And
So,
Dale,
yeah,
could
go
I
for
just
it. Go for
Can
it.
I just add to that? Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just add in, looking at the corporate sector, I think there's a necessary move from corporate social responsibility to corporate social justice. And when I think of corporate social responsibility, I think of, volunteer matching. I think of, statements of solidarity. I think of philanthropic giving. And I think when we talk about education, I think that it is essential that corporations and business move towards making an understanding of what it is to be anti-racist individually and as an organization part of workforce development, part of what you expect from your employees, part of the culture that you build. And so I think that there is education that can happen there if it is seen as a key job responsibility, is seen as a key job role, then you are then forced to create learning opportunities, capacity building opportunities for folks. So I just wanted to toss that in there about corporate social justice.
So that's helpful, because that's an action. And what I want to get to in the last 10 minutes or so here is actions. What can we compel? What can we do to engage the community broadly, not just the activists and named leaders? And really, what do we do in the next 3 to 6 months? What do we do in the next 6 to 18 months to create the change, create the community that we want? Concrete actions. Just a couple minutes each. Let's go ahead and start with April, if you don't mind.
Oh, no, I'm happy to tackle this one. I think first and foremost, right, like the people closest to the problem are also the folks that are closest to the solution. So I think a lot of what needs to happen is what you're doing now in terms of bringing folks together from different industries across different spectrums and hearing ideas, but also, going back to community and building trust. And those of us who represent institutions that historically haven't always been accountable to members of our community have to accept that reality and be willing to humble ourselves to earn the trust of our communities again, so that they will be open and honest with us, and we can figure out how we build power and impact change together. So, like if you're working on policy about plumbing, you talk to plumbers, right? If you're working on policy about childcare, you talk to people who need childcare and childcare providers. So I think the first step is to go back to community, figure out how we earn their trust, and then have those really honest conversations about what policy changes we want to implement and how we center those most impacted by the policies and the solutions. I think some short-term things, obviously in the next 3 to 6 months, like everybody's got to vote. We got to vote the entire ticket. There are some, and not just at the national level, but there are opportunities for us to really elect champions for workers, families, and communities. And we have to take advantage of the opportunity that the power of our vote gives us. In the long term, I would say that, then we need to hold those elected officers accountable to the promises that they've made and to the statements that they've made, and challenge them to take all those wonderful, well-written statements and put them into action. I think additionally, we really need to do the work in Washington State to fully repeal Initiative 200, which was, an initiative that passed in 1998 that effectively made Washington the second state in the nation to repeal affirmative action. And we have seen devastating consequences as a result of that, both in terms of enrollment for Black, Brown, and Pacific Islander students at our public colleges and universities, but also, $3.8 billion in lost economic opportunity for minority and women-owned businesses. And, we could repeal that. We had an opportunity last year with Referendum 88 and Initiative 1000 and fell just a little bit short, but I think we've got to build 1 percentage point, it still hurts. But, we've got to build a coalition. We've got to go back to community. We've got to build a real coalition, and we've got to get back to work and repeal I-200. I think those are some really concrete things that we can start working on right now to create the kind of change that we want to see. And lastly, I'll just make this plug. We have to change our language. We've been talking a lot about when we go back to normal, but I want to suggest that the status quo wasn't normal, and we don't have to accept that as normal. And we can build the kind of future and the kind of economy that all people can thrive in. And that opportunity starts with us, and it starts with you, and it starts tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. Lisa.
Sorry, I was answering a question in the Q&A. Can you re-cue me on your question? Executive Constantine.
Well, first of all, thank you for answering the questions in the Q&A. Second of all, What concrete steps do we take in the next 3 to 6 months, the next 6 to 18 months, or whatever time frame you choose, to really make progress on the world we're talking about in this conversation tonight?
Yeah, so I did prepare, I saw that question coming. I think in my sector, the critical next, few months have to be spent assessing the landscape, assessing readiness of community-based organizations to respond in a new paradigm of public safety and order, identifying gaps, and then coming to you all at the state and local level, also hoping to find federal funding sources, assuming things go as April just recommended, and laying out a very concrete roadmap for how things can get better rapidly. I think we have a limited window, your 6 to 18 month window, which I think was going to be the next question if we had time, is the window in which to demonstrate to people's satisfaction that we can secure public safety and order through new mechanisms. We can, so if we don't, it will be an incredible failure of this moment of opportunity to hold the imagination of the critical mass of people in our region and continue to move strongly in this direction. Backlash is real in this sector. It is almost, you can set your watch by backlash on public order issues. So don't give grist to that mill. Don't add fuel to that fire. Make it really hard to miss that we can do better by taking care of people, by meeting people where they are, meeting people's self-identified needs. So that 3 to 6 month agenda for me is map what's out there, map what is missing, and come to state, local, and federal leaders to ask for the missing pieces so that we demonstrate that the way forward will hold water and meet expectations.
Thank you. Who else would like to jump in on this, or other thoughts that you've had here?
If I could
Mari? Yeah.
just for a second say that I think, that the 3 to 6 months, let's not forget about COVID. It is, the populations that are being hit the hardest are Black, Indigenous, and Latino populations. And I think that we really do need to get a handle on COVID. I want to say a big congratulations to the City of Seattle and King County for making sure, partnering with the University of Washington, for making sure that we have testing in South Seattle and that we have, equitable access to testing. We need to make sure that that continues. We need to make sure that that continues when the vaccine is available, that it be distributed in an equitable fashion. And related to that, we know that the second hit is going to be the economic hit. And I think that we need to look at ways in which we don't just go into austerity mode, which is so often what happens during recessions, and make sure that this recession doesn't widen the gaps. I noticed in chat, for example, that someone spoke about, making sure that, low-income kids have access to the internet. I'm very worried that at the end of this period, we are going to have wider educational gaps than we did at the beginning, because you've got, the upper class kids who have, they're working in pods, they have teachers coming in to work with them, et cetera, and low-income kids who barely have access to an internet that they can use. So we need to make sure that this recession that's coming doesn't make things worse. And that means that we need to really look at things like, tax code. We really need to look at new income sources, because going into austerity mode will just further the gaps that we're seeing and will do anything but the recovery that we need.
I'm really, just from my personal experience, really concerned about the inequities inherent in the remote learning, not just the quality of internet access, but the fact that some kids are able to have a parent at home full time, helping them, and others are not.
Yeah.
And I think I might have mentioned this last time, but my daughter is a first grader. I'm watching the screen, she's being given complex instructions about logging out of this and logging into that, doing independent study. And then I see on the screen a kid who's obviously been placed in a desk, in a cubicle, in a community center with nobody's there at that moment.
Absolutely.
And he just, the look of confusion and being lost in his eyes was heartbreaking. He didn't know what to do as all the other kids were being guided by the adult in the room. And it's just not working.
Absolutely.
And we have to get to the point where at least the kids whose parents have to be out working, who can't have that kind of constant supervision, can be in a different setting, be in a school, be somewhere where they can really be keeping up their education and not feel like they're being abandoned, left behind. Let's continue this for just a couple more minutes. I want to make sure that we get any thoughts that you have on how we can charge ahead here before I draw it to a close. Who is next? Who wants to go next?
I'd be happy to share.
Yeah, go for it.
Just speaking about my sector, right, there are roughly 500 cultural organizations, institutions, thousands of cultural workers. And I feel like over the next 3 to 6 months that their sustainability is truly in peril. So for me, it's how can we invest as much as possible in that necessary resource, which is culture. And I do it not simply because that's my job, but because when we talk about intersectionality and we talk about these difficult conversations, I think that arts and culture play a critical and key role to allow really effective community engagement. When you look out on the streets and who's protesting, you hear the soundtrack, right, of the movement. You see the signs, you hear the narrative of the movement, and you have cultural workers that are so deeply invested in that. When you talk about bringing different sectors together with competing priorities and agendas, often, right, somebody who has a creative background, who comes from cultural work, has the ability, right, through their creativity, through their imagination, to help, I think, put forth not only places where reconciliation can happen in collaboration, but the innovation to put forward ideas that create a better future. So I think that's just absolutely essential. And then if I could just echo everybody else on just tax reform, and it's not going to happen this legislative session, but we need these large coalitions that are going to bring about big change, because that's what we're talking about, the dollars, and we're talking about getting away from this regressive tax structure. So those are the things that I wanted to add. Thank you, Dow.
Thank you. I think April, maybe 30 seconds for a last word.
Yeah, I'm inspired. So I'm going to leave this panel feeling really inspired by this conversation, and would just challenge everyone on this panel and everyone listening tonight to think bold and creative and think big, because if there was ever an opportunity and a time to do it, the time is now. And to think, to not limit ourselves by, the status quo. And lastly, as we're thinking about equity, want to lift up what I heard a long time ago around anti-racist work. And that is that you have to, it's like brushing your teeth. You have to do it every day, twice a day if you want to impress your hygienist. So, one training, one conversation isn't going to create the kind of long-term institutional change we want to see. And just thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
And one thing that I know that Dow and I both really care about, and we may not be able to fix the entire tax structure this next time around, but there's a Harborview bond initiative that's going to be on the ballot, and Harborview is the health safety net for the poorest of the poor and for our community. So we'll have the advantage to do a little bit of something on the tax front.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists from the past panels and this one, and the audience tonight who've taken part in these conversations. As a reminder, the recording for this final session, along with the previous 2 sessions, will be available on the King County Executive Facebook page. I'm very excited about the notion of carrying forward a conversation about many of the things that have been brought up. And again, digging into this issue of Washington's outrageous tax system would be a really good subject for continued conversations like this. I'm grateful to our panelists for bringing their perspectives, contributing to the planning that will go into our regional recovery. And King County has a lot to be proud of and is lucky to have so many powerful leaders, industry-leading experts, engaged, empowered residents. Through these 3 panels, we've started the conversation that will guide policy, collaboration, and momentum toward a more equitable and sustainable post-COVID community. And while I know that the crisis has not nearly passed yet, the struggle is not over, and the road ahead is not an easy one. If we stick together to support the crucial work identified in this process, we will be successful and affecting real change. Once again, thank you all and have a good evening.